So it's also got this sort of very thin tracing paper in it as well, which protects the illustrations. This is an illustration of this is a map of Saint Giles and its vicinity, and it's from 1732 from Armorden and Lee's plan of the City of London. So you can see Lincoln Inn Fields here. This is High Holborn, Red Lion Square, St Giles, the road to Oxford, Covent Garden. So we turn the paper carefully. We see that the title is Bloomsbury and Saint Giles, past and present, with historical and antiquarian notices of the vicinity by George Clinch, with illustrations. London, and publisher is True's Love and Shirley, so the book is dated 1890, so it's quite old. It's got a preface, and then we've got contents, chapter 1, 2 and 3, and the various subjects within each chapter. More chapters in Bloomsbury. Then we have a list of illustrations and maps. But you can see how the pages are starting to come loose. Chapter 1. Now I did see an illustration that I will show you before we have a bit of a read. So this is an illustration from 1591, Map of Saint Giles and its vicinity. So that is amazing. From Acres Map of London, 1591. You can see the River Thames at the bottom, and the different houses and field boundaries and roads. So let's take a bit of a read. Okay. There is good reason for believing that the neighbourhood of London, and especially that part of it lying towards the north, consisted in the time of the Romans of immense forests, and that even as late as the time of Henry II, these extended down to the Thames, and were frequented by various wild animals. The city of London was defended by fosses on every side, except those boundaries of it where the River Thames formed a natural barrier of defence. Between the manors of Saint Giles and Bloomsbury there was an important fosse or ditch, known as Plemons Ditch, which it is probable was part of this system of ditches constructed originally for the purpose of defence. buildings and population have entirely altered this condition of things, but indications of a soil naturally inclined to dampness may still be observed in the heavy fogs of winter, which often hover around Bloomsbury and Saint Giles, when Charing Cross and Westminster are comparatively free from them. St Giles in the Fields in the Middle Ages was merely a suburban village, literally surrounded by fields, as its name suggests. In the time of King John, 1213, it was laid out in garden plots, cottages and other buildings to a certain limited extent. In the time of King Henry III, it assumed the appearance of a scattered country village, having shops and an ancient stone cross standing where High Street now is. About the year 1225, a little blacksmith's shop stood at the northwest end of Drury Lane, which existed until the year 1595, when progressive buildings rendered its demolition necessary. The lower part of Holborn was paved in 1417 and in 1542. Stowe says that High Oldburn Street, leading from the bars towards St Giles, was very full of pits and sloughs, and perilous and noisome to all that repaired and passed that way, as well on foot as on horseback or with carriage, and there were other lanes and places that led out of or into High Oldbourne, as Shoe Lane, Fetter Lane, New Street, or Chancery Lane. Upon complaint whereof, an act was made in the 32nd of Henry VIII to pave all those parts with paving stones from the farther part of Oldbourne unto St Giles in the Fields, as also on the east side of the city, the way from Aldgate to Whitechapel Church, which had the same ill passage, all to be paved and made by the feast of St John the Baptist, 1542, in manner and form as the causey or highway leading from Strand Bridge to Charing Cross had been made and paved. Holborn had been partially paved and mended in the reign of Edward III, but this was the first complete paving. The famous hospital for lepers, which formerly stood where St Giles's Church now stands, was of course the most important feature in the early history of the parish, but it will be better to treat of that institution in another part of this volume. Mention is made in the reign of Queen Elizabeth of the immense line of thick forests extending from the village of St Giles westward towards Tyburn and reaching for a very long distance to the north. This was the great Black Forest of Marylebone. Stowe gives an interesting account of a visitation to the conduits at Tyburn in 1562 by the Lord Mayor, Harper, and aldermen, and many other citizens, masters and wardens of the 12 companies, accompanied by their ladies in waggons, it being usual, after examining the state of them, to give a grand entertainment at the banqueting house. On this occasion, says Stowe, afore dinner they hunted the hare and killed her is shown as a simple lane without a single house in it, save one Drury house at the south end, and the whole stretch of land between it and St Giles's Church is represented as being open meadowland, untouched by the builder. Very much the same condition of things is shown by the map to have existed all over the area which modern Bloomsbury now occupies. Southampton House, situated very near what is now Bloomsbury Square, is represented as an outlying mansion standing in its own grounds and environed by large stretches of pasture land. Holborn, too, had no houses except round about where the entrance to Red Lion Street is, and also near the north end of Drury Lane. Early in the reign of James I, the meadows and lanes began to be built upon. In 1606, Great Queen Street was begun, and Drury Lane had some houses built upon its east side. Shortly after the year 1623, 100 houses were built upon the north side of St Giles's Street, High Street. 71 were built on the south side of Holborn. 56 were built on the west side of Drury Lane. In Great Queen Street there were 15 houses, and in Bloomsbury there were built 136 houses. With the Restoration, a second grand era of building commenced in the Parish of Saint Giles. Lincoln's Inn Fields, which had been laid out and partly built by Indigo Jones, was further improved, and the houses finished on the south side of Queen Street, besides many individual mansions of importance erected. This spirit of building continued during the remainder of the reign of Charles II, and during those of James II, William and Mary and Anne, so that at length the whole parish, excepting some parts of Bloomsbury, became entirely covered with houses. The writer of A New View of London, a curious work published in the year 1708, mentions that the parish of St Giles then contained about 3,000 houses. The enumerated population of the united parishes of St Giles and St George of Bloomsbury, according to the census returns of 1881, was 45,382. The Lepers Hospital. It is recorded by Leland, the antiquary, that Matilda or Maud, daughter of Malcolm, King of Scotland, and the Queen of Henry I, in the year 1101, founded over against the west suburb of London a house for the maintenance of lepers, with an oratory and offices, called the Hospital of St Giles. By the charter of Queen Matilda, provision was made for 40 lepers, 1 chaplain, 1 clerk, and 1 servant. To meet the expenses of this establishment, the hospital was originally endowed with a sum of £3 per annum, a sum Giles's Hospital, although intended for the maintenance of poor lepers, was made a sort of asylum for decayed domestics of the court. Not only was this an injustice towards those whom the foundries of the hospital intended to benefit, but great danger to those who enjoyed sound health arose from mixing with the poor diseased inmates. Edward II, for these reasons, issued a charter which forbade the quartering of old court servants upon the hospital, without licence first obtained from the master and brethren. The ground upon which the hospital stood was originally crown land, and was given, together with the manor of Saint Giles, by the royal foundress Queen Matilda. It consisted, according to the bull of Pope Alexander, of 8 acres of land. As time went on, it is probable that more land was added, and the whole area, as is shown by old maps, was enclosed by a high wall. Upon this ground were built the hospital, with all necessary offices, and an oratory or small chapel. From the charter of King Henry II, it is evident that an earlier parochial church stood upon this spot before the hospital was established. From certain extant documents relating to this hospital, it is evident that considerable additions were made to the fabric from time to time. Mention is made of a great gate and chapter house, and there is no doubt that as valuable gifts of property and money were made, so this excellent institution increased in importance and added to its buildings and the number of its inmates. The parish church of Saint Giles was built by the side of the hospital church, probably upon its north side, and therefore was nearer the public road and more easily accessible to the parishioners than that which was designed for the use of the lepers. The high altar was situated at the east end, and the entrance door at the west end of the church. The lepers' church was probably similar in form and size, but had at its east end an altar dedicated to St. Giles, the patron saint of lepers and of this church. Probably an image of the saint was placed upon the altar, and before this burnt a great taper, called St. Giles's Light, towards the expense of maintaining which, about the year 1200, William Christmas, a parishioner, bequeathed the annual sum of 12d. There was a chapel of St. Michael against the south wall of the church, and towards its eastern end. This no doubt formed a prominent feature in the church, and was probably provided with its own priest or chaplain. From rude delineations of the church of St. Giles, made about 1560, it appears that at the west end of the south, or lepers division of the building, there was a circular tower capped by an odd-looking dome, semi-globular, or rather, perhaps semi-ovate in shape. The wealth of St. Giles's Hospital had become so great in the time of Henry VIII as to form a desirable success was then holding up to ridicule, had to some extent unfavourably prejudiced the public mind upon the question, but it does not appear very fair or logical that the punishment for irregularities of monastic and conventual establishments should have been visited upon an institution such as St. Giles's Hospital, whose object was one of the highest and noblest to which it is possible for wealth and skill to be applied, the relief of the suffering and infirm or diseased poor. Henry's stern measure aimed a carefully directed blow, which was calculated not only to punish and reform abuses, but also to scatter riches and possessions which had been accumulated and bestowed in many cases by a pious and well-meaning ancestry. The blow was struck by a hand which was not slow to grasp any object which fancy desired or avarice coveted. Then of course we've got this lovely picture that we had a look at before. For 6 years, the royal spoiler retained in his own possession the hospital and lands of St. Giles, and then he bestowed it, together with Burton St. Lazare, upon our beloved counsellor John Dudley, Knight of the most noble order of the Garter, Viscount Lisle, and our great Admiral of England. Lord Lisle, on receiving this grant of the hospital, fitted up the principal part of the building as a residence for himself, and leased various subordinate parts of the structure to different tenants, as well as portions of the adjoining ground, gardens, etc., and having dwelt there 2 years, obtained the King's licence to convey the whole of the premises to John Wymond Carew, Esquire. An extraordinary custom was formerly concocted with the Hospital of St. Giles, when the gallows stood at the north-west end of High Street. Criminals condemned to death, in journeying from the city or from Holborn, would necessarily have to pass the hospital wall. Here, at the Great Gate, they were presented with a bowl of ale as their last refreshment in life. From long continued usage, this became a confirmed custom, and was looked upon as a regular item in the melancholy programme, when criminals were conveyed to their executions. In later days, when the gallows was erected